The city lights reflected in the raindrops on the windshield, turning the night road into a kaleidoscope of red, yellow, and white. Emma gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring intently at the blurred ribbon of highway in front of her. Her pet, a small, furry dog named Max, lay quietly curled up in the passenger seat. Her wheelchair, her faithful companion since the tragic accident 2 years ago, lay neatly in the trunk. It was an ordinary night. The familiar route, the familiar noise of the radio program Emma had turned on for company. Each of her days was carefully planned to leave no room for the unexpected. She'd learned to live like this after she'd lost the ability to walk. Every trip out on the road was for her an act of small triumph over fate. But everything changed when red and blue lights flashed in the rearview mirror. Emma froze, her heart jumping to her throat. She hadn't been speeding, hadn't broken any rules. Why? Her hands gripped the steering wheel involuntarily, and 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. Perhaps the policeman had simply made a mistake. Or was this a routine check? Max sensed her tension and lifted his head, whimpering softly. Emma glanced up at him, trying to find calm in his soft brown eyes. She slowed down slowly and pulled to the curb. The red-blue light flashed closer and closer, like an ominous signal that the night would cease to be ordinary. The traffic on the road had almost stopped, and passers-by began to turn around. Someone in a neighboring car was already pulling out his phone to take pictures. Emma inhaled deeply, trying to suppress her anxiety, but the premonition was weighing heavily on her chest. When the policeman got out of the car, his footsteps sounded on the pavement like the loud strikes of a clock. He took his time, as if savoring every second. Tall, in a dark uniform, with a cold stare, he came to her window. "Good evening." His voice was low, but not at all friendly. "Your documents." Emma immediately held out her driver's license, disability card, and insurance card. She smiled, trying to be polite, but the policeman didn't even look at her. Instead, he scrutinized the car, focusing his eyes on Max. "Is that your dog?" he asked sharply, his voice even colder. "Yes, he's always with me," Emma answered, feeling the tension in her voice betray her fear. "It's just a test, right?" The policeman straightened abruptly, looking down at her. "Get out of the car." Emma froze. Those words sounded like a sentence. "Why?" she wanted to ask, but something in his gaze kept her silent. She knew it was dangerous to argue with this man. She slowly removed her seatbelt, looked back at Max, who was starting to worry, and tried to pull herself together. But as soon as she opened the door and saw the policeman gesture to another officer, it was clear to her that this night wasn't going to go the way she'd expected. The world of her familiar routine began to crack at the seams. Emma stood on shaky legs, leaning on the car door. She struggled with every movement, her wheelchair-bound body screaming in pain. The policeman watched her struggles coldly, offering no help or sympathy. "Are you having trouble with your ears, miss?" he threw sharply. "I told you to get out of the car, not to make a play." Emma swallowed, trying to stay calm. There was no doubt in his tone. He wasn't going to listen. Max barked quietly from the car, worried about his mistress. The policeman gave the dog an angry look, as if he were a threat. "I'm sorry, officer. I need some time," she began, moving around carefully. "I have a disability, and I use a wheelchair. It's in the trunk." He interrupted her, shaking his head with a chuckle. "Disability, huh? Interesting. You seem confident behind the wheel for some reason. Maybe you're just pretending." Emma flinched as if his words had been a blow. She opened her mouth to reply, but his face grew even more arrogant. All right, that's enough time to waste. Let's see what you've got in there. He nodded toward the trunk. Open it up. Of course, she agreed, despite the tremor in her voice. She realized that if she didn't comply, things would only get worse. Opening the trunk, she mentally prayed that her papers and wheelchair would convince him. But when the trunk opened, he only grinned. What is this? A set? To evoke pity? Do you think I'm a fool? Emma felt the heat flood her face. She could hardly find the strength to answer. This is my wheelchair. I can't walk long distances. That's easy to check in my medical records. Oh, I'll check, he said, and there was something frightening in his voice. But, it won't save you. I've seen your kind before. First they complain about their disability, and then they get caught doing something worse. Like me? Emma asked, her voice quiet, but her emotions were boiling inside. He leaned closer so she could feel his heavy breathing. The kind who think they can drive like white people, break the rules, and then pretend to be victims? You're out of place, miss. His gaze burned into her. Maybe you should have learned to respect the law to begin with. Emma was speechless. Those words, filled with venom, seemed to shatter her defenses. She tried to explain again. Officer, please see my papers. I wasn't trespassing. I was just on my way home. But he wasn't listening anymore. He stepped toward the car and peered inside where Max was barking, protecting his mistress. The policeman straightened, looked back at her sharply. The dog stays. We'll take the car for inspection. What? She blurted it out. You can't do this. It's my pet. He didn't do anything. He laughed, but the laugh was cold, almost predatory. You forget, miss. I can do whatever I want. Now step away from the car. Emma felt her legs start to shake. She wanted to scream, to resist, but her voice seemed to disappear. She was alone, surrounded by indifference. The policeman's shadow blocked her light, and she realized that the night was just beginning, and her nightmare was just taking shape. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from and whether you have had something similar in your life. Perhaps you have faced injustice or prejudice. Your stories are important, and we want to hear them. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And now, we continue. Emma felt the cold air hit her face as the policeman's rough hand grabbed her shoulder sharply. He didn't wait for her to make a move or ask for time to get out of the car. He just tore her forward like a doll, ignoring the way she tried helplessly to lean on the door. I told you, I need a wheelchair, she exclaimed, grabbing desperately at the car to keep from falling. Come on, he said with a grin, glancing casually over his shoulder. If you drive a car, you can stand. Don't make it up. A crowd on the sidewalk was beginning to gather. People stopped, pulling out their phones and watching, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Only occasional whispers reached Emma, as if her humiliation were a show. Did you see that? She says she needs a wheelchair, but she walks quite normally, one man whispered to the woman next to him. Disabled? Threw the woman with disbelief in her voice. She just wants to complain to the police. Emma couldn't believe this was happening to her. Her fingers still had a firm grip on the door, but the policeman didn't give her a chance. He pushed her forward so that she could barely stand. Stay here. Don't move. His voice was soaked with irritation. Another officer went to the trunk, opened it abruptly, and pulled out a wheelchair. Instead of setting it down neatly, he threw it on the ground next to the curb like unwanted trash. The metal body hit the pavement with a thud that made Emma's heart ache. Is this yours? The first policeman asked sarcastically, glancing down at her. "I think it's too expensive for a car like this. Are you sure you bought it with honest money?" Emma was too shocked to answer. The crowd began to whisper even louder. Someone even started laughing. Someone shouted, "That's not normal. Why is she even driving?" She took a step toward the wheelchair, but was stopped by a sharp gesture from the policeman. "Did you hear me, miss? Stay where you are," he shouted, blocking her way. Max had been barking hysterically from the car the whole time, his voice like a cry of despair. But instead of paying attention to the dog, the second policeman came closer and peered into the cabin. "Maybe we should check him out," he said, nodding mockingly at the dog. "You never know what you'll find with people like her." Emma felt everything inside her boil. Those words, "people like her," sounded like a punch in the face. She knew what they meant. Her skin color, her disability, her presence here on this road seemed wrong to these people. "Please leave my dog alone," she said, trying to hold back tears. "Or maybe it's up to me to decide what to keep and what not to keep," the first policeman replied, his voice cold and cruel. The situation was getting worse. Emma looked back at the crowd, hoping someone would stand up for her, say a word, but people kept filming. One man raised his phone higher to get a better shot. "This is insane," Emma shrieked, looking at them. "You're all seeing this. Why isn't anyone doing anything?" Her words hung in the air without a shred of sympathy. It was clear to her. She was alone here. The policeman stepped closer, blocking her view, and said quietly, but loud enough for her to hear, "Nobody cares about you. Now shut your mouth, or it's going to get worse." Her humiliation was total. Her own wheelchair lay on the curb as a symbol of her helplessness, and the crowd watched as if it were a spectacle. Max continued to bark, but his voice grew quieter and quieter, as did Emma's hope for justice. Max, the little dog, didn't stop barking. His shrill voice broke the tense silence, making Emma both anxious and faintly hopeful that his barking might arouse a little sympathy in some of the people around her. But the barking only annoyed the policeman. "Is that mutt of yours going to settle down?" he said sharply, glancing at the car where the sound had come from. "Or do I have to do it myself?" Emma, standing next to the overturned wheelchair, felt her heart clench. She knew Max was only trying to protect her, but in this man's eyes, all he was doing was making things worse. "Please don't hurt him," she said, her voice shaking, but she still found the strength to speak. "He's not hurting anyone. He's just worried about me." The policeman grinned, his grin filled with contempt. "Of course she's worried. You know, I'm beginning to think you don't know how to raise dogs or yourself." The words were frankly humiliating, and Emma knew it. But before she could answer, he stepped to the car and opened the door. Max immediately jumped into the seat, his little body tensing and barking even louder. He lunged toward the edge of the door, ready to defend his mistress, but his height and size made him a threat only in his own mind. "Look how brave he is," said the policeman, sitting down in front of the open door. "I wonder how long he'll be so brave if I do this." He reached for the dog, and Emma, forgetting her position, screamed, "Don't touch him. He's just protecting me." The policeman turned his head toward her, and something dark and frightening flashed in his eyes. He straightened sharply and stepped toward her. "You're not in charge here, okay?" His voice was low, threatening. "This mutt of yours barks in my face, and you let him yell at me? Need I remind you who's in charge here?" Emma was silent, looking at him. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Max, as if sensing that the situation was becoming dangerous, barked again, but this time his barking sounded almost desperate. The policeman glanced at the dog, his face contorted with irritation. "I've had enough," he said, moving toward the car. "If you can't handle that dog, I'll take care of it myself." "No," Emma exclaimed, stepping forward, but her legs gave out and she collapsed next to the wheelchair. "He's my dog. He's not a threat to anyone. Please don't do this." The policeman didn't stop. He opened the back door, grabbed Max by the scruff of his neck, and pulled him out of the car. The dog's small body wriggled, his barking became intermittent. He was scared, but he didn't give up. "Take him away. It's not his fault." Emma was almost screaming, her voice torn with despair. The crowd watched what was happening, but no one moved from their seats. People continued filming, some even commenting. "It's just a dog. Why's it yelling like that?" "Yeah, but he could be dangerous. The police know what they're doing." Emma couldn't believe her ears. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst. The policeman lifted Max a little higher so that the dog was level with his face and said quietly, "Barking at a cop? This is a bad idea, buddy. It's a very bad idea." Emma tried to rise, but her body refused to obey. She felt utterly helpless, watching her little friend flounder in the arms of a man who seemed to enjoy her suffering. The policeman cast a quick glance at her, a wicked grin lighting up his face. "Maybe I should show you how to raise someone like him." His words sounded like a threat. In that second, Emma realized that something irreparable would happen in the next instant. Her world was crumbling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do about it. Emma lay on the cold ground next to the overturned wheelchair. Her breathing was ragged, and her face burned with humiliation. She tried to rise, resting her palms on the ground, but the weakness in her legs and the weight of everything that was happening around her kept her chained to the pavement. The crowd seemed to grow even closer, their eyes and cameras seeming to dig into her like sharp needles. The policeman, still holding Max in his arms, leaned a little closer to the dog and squeezed his fingers sharply around his neck. Max whimpered hysterically, his small body twitching in his aggressor's arms. Emma screamed, her voice filled with despair. "Please stop. You can see he hasn't done anything to you." The policeman cast a look of contempt at her, and his tone became even more icy. "You still don't get it, miss? I told you something and you keep resisting. So maybe you should learn to obey the law before you get a dog." Emma struggled to sit up, her hands trembling. She held them out, as if she could somehow stop him, make him change his mind. "He's my only friend. You don't understand. He saves me every day," she begged, her voice breaking with tears. "Please, just let him go. I'll do anything you say. Just don't hurt him." But her words drowned in his indifference. The policeman tossed the dog into the back seat of his patrol car, slammed the door shut, and slowly straightened up. Max continued to bark, but the sound was muffled by the glass. Emma felt like a part of her soul was being ripped out of her. "Still don't understand," he said, looking down at her. "You're nothing here. You're not even worthy of respect. I knew you'd be trouble the moment I saw that car in your face." Emma tensed when she heard those words. She felt a wave of anger inside her, but her body was too weak to act. She was helpless, and so was her wheelchair, lying a few feet away from her. "This is discrimination," she shouted, gathering the rest of her courage. "You have no right to treat me like this." The policeman froze for a second, his face hard. He stepped closer to her, his shadow covering her completely. "Discrimination?" he hissed. "Are you serious? With your attitude, you should be thanking me for wasting my time on you at all. Or do you think your problems give you some kind of privilege?" He pointed to a wheelchair that lay sideways like a forgotten toy. Is that your justification, or is it your tool to manipulate people?" The crowd around him began to whisper louder. Some chuckled, others nodded approvingly. The cameras kept rolling. Emma looked around, her eyes searching for a single face willing to stand up for her, but everyone stood silent, as if she were an exhibit in a museum of human humiliation. She tried to rise again, but her body failed her again. The policeman stepped toward her, leaned over, and, almost in a whisper, said, "You know what the funny thing is? Nobody cares about you. Not your dog, not your disability, not your complaints. You're just another troubled woman who thinks she can demand special treatment." Emma looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears, but she remained silent. She knew that if she said another word, it would only make things worse. She was all alone, surrounded by indifference and cruelty. The policeman stepped back, casting another glance at her car. "We'll have to take your car, too. It's evidence. Do you have any objections?" "Well, who cares what you think?" He grinned and turned to the crowd as if expecting applause. Emma was left sitting on the ground next to a wheelchair that no one was even trying to put in place. Her world was crumbling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The thick smoke floated over the road, and the cold night air was filled with a tense silence that seemed deafening. The policeman approached Emma's car. His movements were slow, almost lazy, but there was a sense of menace in them. Emma, sitting on the ground next to the wheelchair, tried desperately to understand what he was going to do, but her mind refused to accept the worst. He threw her a quick glance, full of contempt, before opening her car door. "It seems your possessions are no longer of value," he said with a chuckle. "I don't think anyone will miss it." "What are you doing?" Emma screamed, trying to get up, but her legs wouldn't budge. "Pull over. It's my car. Please stop." The policeman didn't answer. He pulled something shiny out of his pocket, a lighter. "You know, I'm tired of listening to you complain." He flicked his lighter, and a small flame flickered in his hands. "Maybe you'll realize what it means to listen when you have nothing left." The crowd gasped, but no one moved. The cameras kept rolling, some of them even whispering. "He's not serious, is he? He's just scaring her, right?" Emma felt her heart sink. She screamed again, her voice full of terror. "My dog's in there. Max is inside. Stop. Please, I'm begging you." But he wasn't listening. He leaned over, lighter in hand, and held it up to the seat. A small flame touched the upholstery, and in a moment the fire began to grow. The policeman straightened up, watching with satisfaction as the fire consumed the interior. "It's a lesson to people like you," he said, turning to Emma. "Don't think you're allowed everything just because you can complain about life." Emma screamed again, her voice tearing through the night, but her words went unanswered. The fire was gaining strength, flames devouring the seats, filling the car with thick smoke. Max, her little faithful friend, barked from inside, his voice full of fear and pain. He was banging his paws against the windows, but he couldn't get out. "No!" Emma screamed, grabbing her hair. "No, please help him. Somebody make it stop." The crowd stood in a stupor. Some of the faces expressed horror, but no one moved. They just watched the fire grow, and Emma's screams and Max's barks became less and less audible over the crackling of the flames. "It's too late," someone in the crowd said, taking pictures on his phone. The policeman stepped back, his face calm, as if he were observing something routine. He turned to Emma, who was crawling toward the car, trying to do something. "You shouldn't have broken the law," he said with a cold smile. "Now you have time to think about your actions." The fire engulfed the entire car. Max stopped barking in one last desperate spurt, his silhouette disappearing behind a veil of black smoke. Emma froze, her body no longer listening and her mind refusing to accept reality. She felt the world collapse around her, leaving only pain, emptiness, and ash. The policeman turned away and walked to his car without looking back. The crowd began to disperse, leaving her alone on the cold ground, next to the overturned wheelchair and the burning wreckage of her life. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether something similar has happened in your life. Perhaps you have faced injustice or situations that made you feel helpless. Share your experiences. It's important for us to know your point of view. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now we continue. A fiery flash struck the night sky, turning the darkness into a hellish light. Emma's face lit up with a yellow-orange glow, reflected in her eyes wide open with terror. She sat on the cold ground, her body shaking with fear and despair, and the burning car was like a portal to her own hell. Her little dog, Max, who had always been her comfort and protector, fell silent. That lingering moment of silence that filled her inner emptiness was worse than any scream. The people around them froze like stone statues, their faces lit up by the light of the fire, but none of them moved to help. Emma could see phones flickering in the hands of some, cameras pointed at her in the car, capturing every second of her suffering. Their faces expressed neither fear nor sympathy. They looked at her as if she was part of some spectacle that could simply be recorded and then forgotten. A man with a low voice said to someone nearby, "Well, it's always like this. They make trouble and then complain that they're being mistreated." That phrase stabbed into her mind like a knife. They didn't see her as a person. They didn't see her pain, her fear, her grief. To them, she was only a picture, a symbol of someone else's hatred or a confirmation of their own prejudices. She tried to rise again. Her hands trembled as she rested them on the ground, but her legs, which had been disobedient for the past 2 years, refused to serve her again. She reached for her wheelchair, which was lying on its side, and pulled it closer. Her breathing was heavy, tears streaming down her cheeks, mixing with the dirt on her face. She knew it was too late. She watched the flames devour everything that had been her life. "Max, ... she whispered, her voice barely audible. She closed her eyes, but it didn't help. The image of the dog, fearfully pawing at the glass, was forever imprinted in her mind. That sound, the last cry, would never leave her. She opened her eyes again, and there was only the burning car in front of her, its reflections reminding her the worst of it. She had lost everything. The policeman stood nearby, arms crossed over his chest, watching with cold calm. His face remained indifferent, his lips curved slightly into a smirk. He seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. His gaze settled on her, and there was something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It was the look of a man who knew his actions would go unpunished. "I told you," he said at last, his voice flat, almost taut. "It's always trouble with people like you. You never listen. Maybe now you'll learn to respect the law." Emma couldn't answer. Her voice was cut off by the shouting, and her words no longer made sense. She looked at the crowd again, trying to find a single person willing to help her. But they only stood and watched. The cameras kept filming. Some of the spectators even commented on what was happening. "She probably deserved it herself," she heard a woman's voice from the crowd. "Why else would they do this to her?" "Yeah, people like her are always looking for trouble," someone else added. The words were like a spit in her face. Emma closed her eyes again, but instead of darkness, all she saw was fire. This fire wasn't just the flames destroying her car and killing her friend. It was the fire of hatred that had surrounded her all her life, a fire that had been burning her alive even before this night. She didn't know how much time had passed, maybe minutes, maybe hours. When the fire finally died down, only the black charred frame of her car remained. There was nothing left of Max. Emma sat on the ground, feeling the cold creeping into her bones, but it was nothing compared to the cold inside her. She wasn't crying anymore. She had no strength left. The policeman stepped closer, stopped in front of her, and looked down again. "I think that's it," he said, as if he had just finished a routine job. "Next time, try to behave yourself." He turned around and headed for his car, leaving her sitting alone in the middle of the wreckage of her life. The crowd began to disperse, but no one approached her. She was left alone, with an overturned wheelchair and a pile of ashes where her motorhome had once been. The policeman returned to Emma, his heavy footsteps sounding like the beating of a clock counting down the last seconds of her dignity. She sat on the cold ground, exhausted, eyes full of emptiness. Her wheelchair lay to the side, useless, like a broken toy. Her world had been destroyed. Her only friend, Max, had disappeared in the fire, and now this man loomed over her, a symbol of everything she hated and feared. "Get up," he said sharply, his voice full of an orderly tone, as if she were a soldier who had disobeyed her commander. Emma looked up, her lips trembling, but the words never came out. She looked down at her legs, which hadn't listened to her in 2 years. A new wave of fear and humiliation flared inside her. "Yeah, I can't," she whispered finally, her voice so weak it was barely audible. The policeman raised an eyebrow mockingly and crossed his arms over his chest, looking down at her. "You can't?" he interjected, his tone full of sarcasm. "Or don't want to? You know, I'm tired of people like you. It's always the same. Complaints, excuses. You think your legs give you the right to disobey?" She couldn't believe her ears. His words cut like a knife, and each phrase left a deep wound in her soul. She wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, but her throat constricted, and all she could do was whisper again, "I really can't stand up. I have a disability. The wheelchair. It's right there. I can use it." The policeman looked at the wheelchair lying on its side a few feet away, and his face contorted into a contemptuous grin. "Oh yes, your wheelchair," he said, taking a step toward her. "How did you get here then?" "Oh, I know. I guess you have a magic power that lets you drive but disappears when it comes to responsibility." The crowd began to gather again, people whispering, some pulling out their phones to continue filming. Emma could hear them whispering, their voices filled with judgment. "Is that a new tactic? Pretending to be helpless?" said one of the onlookers, a woman with a cold expression. "Yeah, they always do," the man next to her added. "They think their special position entitles them to everything." Emma could feel her breathing getting heavier and heavier. She couldn't listen to those words anymore, couldn't look at the people who looked at her with such contempt, as if she were not a person but an object of their ridicule. She tried to rise again, leaning on her arms, but her body treacherously refused to obey. She fell back to the ground, the pain of the blow echoing in every cell of her body. The policeman snorted, as if she were a comedian performing a bad joke. He slowly pulled the handcuffs from his pocket, their metallic sheen reflecting the light of the street lamp. Emma froze. Her eyes widened with fear, and she shook her head as if that would stop him. "Please, no," she begged, her voice breaking, tears spilling from her eyes again. But he wasn't listening. He stepped toward her, grabbed her wrists roughly, and yanked her arms back. The metal of the handcuffs sank coldly into her skin, causing a searing pain. Her hands were as helpless as her legs, but he didn't care. "If you can't get up, you'll sit," he said, snapping the cuffs on with a loud click. "You're used to it anyway, aren't you?" Those words burned her worse than the flames that had just destroyed her life. Her face contorted in pain and humiliation. She was a prisoner on the ground, her wheelchair lying off to the side, ignored like herself. She felt like a nobody, a void, an object of someone else's malice. The crowd watched in silence. Some whispered discussions that she probably deserved it, others just skimmed. No one came up to help her, no one took her side. She was alone, completely alone. The policeman picked her up by her handcuffs as if she were a piece of cargo and dragged her to his car. Her feet dragged on the ground and she struggled to keep her balance. The metal of the handcuffs cut her wrists, but she didn't resist. She knew that resisting wouldn't change anything, only make things worse. When he got her into the patrol car, he abruptly slammed the door shut, leaving her inside. Her breathing was ragged and tears streamed down her cheeks. She glanced through the window at her wheelchair, left in the driveway like a forgotten object. Her life was ruined, her pride destroyed, her hope gone. She sat in the patrol car feeling like there was nothing else left, only fear, humiliation, and emptiness. The morning brought not only cold and gray skies, but also a whole storm in the virtual world. The video of the incident, shot from different angles by dozens of phone cameras, has already spread across the internet, causing an avalanche of comments, arguments, and discussions. Every detail has been recorded. The burning car, Emma's desperate screams, and the indifferent policeman waving away her requests like an annoying insect. But instead of the sympathy and anger she was desperately waiting for, Emma was met with a new wave of hatred, even more destructive than anything that had happened on the road. On the screen of her phone, which she could barely get out of her pocket, after hours in the police station, headlines flashed. Another case of police brutality or an attempt at manipulation? Why is society divided in its assessment? Wheelchair or a tool to avoid responsibility? Each new headline hit her soul, leaving her with the feeling that her existence had been reduced to a single incident the night before, as if her entire life up to that point had no meaning. The comments under the video filled her with fear and disgust. Again, they start their discrimination song. Maybe they should have just listened to the police. I feel sorry for the dog, but it's her own fault. First it violates and then it complains. If she's really handicapped, how did she even drive the car? I think there's something fishy going on. Emma read this while sitting on the edge of her bed in the small apartment where she had been taken after a long interrogation. Her body ached and her wrists were bruised from the handcuffs. A wheelchair stood in the corner of the room, reminding her of her helplessness. She wanted to feel some sympathy, but instead, with each new comment, she felt her world crumble more and more. Of course, there were those who tried to defend her. That's horrible. How could a person and her pet be treated like this? Some wrote. She lost everything and you're blaming her. But those voices were drowned in a sea of negativity and cynical reasoning. People argued with each other as if she were an abstract topic of debate, rather than a living person with a heart that was breaking in pain. Her name became a meme. Images of her lying on the ground next to a wheelchair were used for jokes, for caricatures. Someone drew a motor on the wheelchair and captioned it. "This is how real disabled people escape the law." Someone put dramatic music on the video and added sarcastic captions that went viral on social media. She couldn't stop the flow. It was like an avalanche that swallowed her whole, depriving her of even the right to simply exist. Emma could not shake the thought that she was not a person in the eyes of these people, but a symbol. Her skin color, her wheelchair, her dog, her tears, all of this became a cause for discussion, for arguments, for ridicule. She no longer belonged to herself. She became part of someone else's agenda, someone else's war. She tried to contact the lawyer she'd been offered at the station, but the man seemed more interested in closing the case as soon as possible. "Listen, miss," he said, holding the receiver on the other end of the line. "You don't stand a chance. The cop was just doing his job. With a video like that, you're more likely to arouse anger than sympathy." Those words finally broke her. She wanted to fight, wanted to prove that she was innocent, that she deserved justice, but all she had was the charred remains of her car, the emptiness of her apartment, and the silence that now settled forever in her life. When she once again opened up social media to read another flood of hate, she felt like screaming. Why couldn't anyone see her pain? Why was even her suffering being ripped apart and turned into a weapon? She glanced at the comments again. Maybe she just needed to follow the rules. A wheelchair doesn't give you the right to break the law. How much can you whine about racism? Maybe it's not about racism. Maybe it's just that she's just a troubled person. Emma closed the phone, but the screen still burned in her mind. Those words were like burns that wouldn't heal. She sat in silence, feeling her soul turn to emptiness. She had lost her car. She had lost her friend. She had lost her faith in people. Now she felt like she had lost herself as well. When Emma woke up, gray morning was already filtering through the curtains of her small apartment. Her body ached with tension, her wrists still throbbing with pain from the marks of the handcuffs. She didn't know what made her open her phone, the desire to know what was going on, or the quiet hope that the world was beginning to forget what had happened. But instead, she found herself in the center of the storm. Her face stared back at her from the screen, contorted with pain and despair. The video of her screaming, begging the policeman to stop, had gone viral on the internet. The burning car, her broken wheelchair, Max's desperate barking all became symbolic, but not what she expected. Her suffering became a battleground for people who didn't even know her name. In the comments under the video, some cried injustice, accusing police of brutality, racism, and abuse of power. "How can this even happen? This is pure madness," they wrote, but those voices seemed to be drowned out by the wave of hatred that swelled around her name. It's her own fault. What was she doing driving if she has a disability? One user asked. The wheelchair, the dog, the tears, too many coincidences. Seems like someone was playing to the public on purpose, wrote another. Why does everyone think it's about racism? Maybe we should just follow the law, they added. Emma felt something inside her break with each line she read. People who knew nothing about her used her pain to justify their prejudices. They argued, insulted, ridiculed her. Someone created a meme of her face, overlaying it with the phrase, I'm a victim and you're obligated to feel sorry for me. She wasn't just humiliated, she was trampled. The news picked up the story. Eyewitness footage flashed on the TV screen. The anchors with serious faces were discussing what had happened, but their voices sounded hollow, like the comments she was reading. This incident has raised important questions about the actions of the police. However, were the woman's actions justified? Said the journalist, looking into the camera. Emma turned off the TV, feeling anger mixed with powerlessness. She had been made not a person, but an object of discussion, a cause for debate. The doorbell brought her out of the murky void. Emma struggled to the door, pushing her wheelchair forward. A reporter stood on the doorstep, a young man with a notebook and a camera on his shoulder. "Miss, would you care to make a comment?" he asked, his voice sounding strained and polite. "Your story has generated a lot of publicity. People want to know how you feel." Emma froze. What was she feeling? She had lost her car, her dog, her faith in justice. She had become an object of hatred, a target for abuse. What could she say? "Go away," she whispered, but her voice trembled. The reporter stood still. "We want to help you tell your side of the story," he insisted. "This is your opportunity. Go away," she screamed, her voice louder, breaking through the pain. She slammed the door in his face and felt the tears run down her cheeks again. She pulled away from the door, feeling her chest tighten with suffocating despair. Her home was no longer her refuge. She knew the reporter would be back, or someone else. They all wanted to use her as a symbol, as a victim, as an object for their own purposes. No one wanted to hear her. Her phone vibrated again. She looked at the screen. Dozens of notifications. Someone had found her name, her address. Posts were already appearing on social media with headlines like, "This is where that woman lives." She was attacked not only in the comments, but in reality. "Maybe you should apologize to the cop," wrote one user in private messages. "You're only dishonoring your race," another added. Emma turned off her phone and threw it on the couch. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst out of her chest. She no longer felt safe even in her own home. She stared at her wheelchair that had become her prison, at the walls that no longer protected her, at the world that had decided she didn't deserve sympathy. She covered her face with her hands, feeling the darkness fill her from the inside out. Her life was ruined, and even in her pain, she was alone. The internet, the crowd, the reporters, everyone was looking at her, but no one saw her. She was a resonance in the void, an echo that is lost in the noise of hate. The darkness hugged her like an old friend. Light entered the cell only through a narrow slit under the door, creating a faint streak across the concrete floor. Emma sat on the iron bench, the cold permeating her body, but she barely noticed it. Her eyes were staring into the void, but the images of that night still flashed before her eyes. The fire reflected in the glass of her car, the angry faces of the crowd, the policeman handcuffing her wrists as if she were a criminal to be broken. Her wheelchair remained there on the road, abandoned like herself. Here, in her cell, she crawled across the floor, clinging to the walls to reach water or climb up on a bench. The officers who saw her helplessness didn't even try to help. One of them laughed when she tried to explain that she could not move without a wheelchair. "Well, you got here somehow, didn't you? Then you can handle it," he said, giving her an indifferent look. Her body ached, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the pain that burned inside her. She'd lost Max, her loyal friend. His eyes full of fear, his desperate attempts to get out of the car, It haunted her even in the darkness of the cell. She'd lost the car, the only thing that gave her any freedom. And now she had lost herself. Her name had become a symbol, but not something she wanted to wear. She could hear snippets of conversation from the guards discussing her case. "It's her, the one," they said, but their tone was filled not with sympathy but with contempt. To them, she was just another scandal, someone who had broken the rules and was now reaping the consequences. Memories of what she read on the internet poisoned her mind. People discussed her disability, her skin color, her screams. They turned her life into an object of ridicule, her pain into an argument. Even those who tried to defend her did so as if she were just an example of their own righteousness, not a living person. She thought about her family, about the friends she hardly had left after the accident. No one had come to see her. No one had called. Maybe they were afraid or ashamed. She didn't know. She was alone, imprisoned in a cold cell, as if her existence no longer meant anything. But somewhere deep inside, in the very heart of that pain, something was slowly beginning to smolder. Her mind returned again and again to the policeman's words. "People like you always cause trouble." Those words were filled with hate, but there was truth in them. She had indeed become a problem. But not the problem he wanted her to be. She realized that her pain was not just her own. It was the pain of millions of people who face the same cruelty, the same contempt. People who were humiliated for their skin color, for their disability, for simply daring to exist in this world. Her suffering was only part of the big picture, but she could be a voice for those who could never speak. Emma closed her eyes, letting the memories of Max pass through her like a wave. She could feel the tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't try to stop them. Her friend was dead, her life was ruined, but she couldn't let it be in vain. When the cell door opened and the guard said she was being released on bail, she struggled to get up, leaning against the walls. Her wheelchair was gone. It had probably been thrown away like garbage. She walked step by step out of the cell, feeling her legs wobbling, but something inside her grew firmer. When she stepped outside, the sunlight blinded her, but with it came a realization. She would no longer be silent. Her life was in ruins, but from the ashes of her hope, something new would begin to grow. She would become a symbol, but not a victim. She would be a voice for those who had been tried and broken, but who had found the strength to stand up and move on. We want to know what you think about our story. Write in the comments what you think about what happened. How do you feel about the situation described in the story? Have you experienced racism, injustice, or discrimination in your life? Perhaps you have seen or experienced something similar. Share your story. Your experiences and opinions are incredibly important to us. We strive to create a space where everyone can be heard. We appreciate each of you and thank you for spending time with our stories. It motivates us to keep sharing these challenging but important topics. Subscribe to our channel, put a like to support us, and keep up to date with new stories. We really value your support. May your day be filled with light, kindness, and justice.